Good afternoon and welcome to the Eurostat webinar on the European food chain. We're going to have an introduction from the Eurostat director and a presentation from one of the statisticians in charge of the book, and I'll introduce them as we get to that. But first I'd like to just do a little bit of housekeeping. We will be collecting questions via Slido, and we have a QR code and a number that you can use to pose questions via Slido, and there'll be a panel to answer your questions at the end of this webinar. At the end, we would like you to stay around briefly after the webinar concludes, because we will also post on Slido at the end a short survey so that we can find out more about what your thoughts were on the webinar. Right, so we will start by inviting Viveka Palm, who is the Director of Sectoral and Regional Statistics at Eurostat, the directorate that includes agricultural statistics, to introduce this presentation. So over to you, Viveka.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Viveka Palm, and I'm the Director of Regional and Sectoral Statistics at Eurostat. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this webinar about the second edition of our publication, Key Figures on the European Food Chain. As you know, the European food chain has faced considerable challenges in the past year. We've had the economic challenges of rising costs, particularly for energy, and also of the trade disruption caused by the war in Ukraine. We've also had the social challenges as the world has emerged from the strict COVID restrictions, and we've had the environmental challenges posed by climate change. This has in turn made other things happen. We've had a cost of living crisis, we've had worries about food poverty, and also concerns about EU food security. We've had the reason to look for data about the frequency of droughts, also to see where the farmers of the future can come from, and to generally look at the sustainability of our food system. It's clear to see that there is growing interest among people in general and politicians in special in having a rounded picture of the European food chain. So on top of being the follow-up of the European Commission's Farm to Fork strategy that aims to establish a sustainable food system in the EU that is fair, healthy, and environmentally friendly, the second edition of the publication has tried to respond to the more immediate concerns. So the publication uses intuitive visualizations and innovative data presentations to support concise analysis. It follows the structure of the food chain. It starts with an overview of agriculture and fisheries, and is able to draw on a wealth of new data from the Agricultural Census 2020 for the 9 million farms across the EU. Some products are sold raw or processed directly from farms, but most agriculture and fisheries goods pass through a much more complex food chain. This chain also relies on a range of imported goods, which is why the EU's trade exposure to Ukraine and Russia in agricultural goods is examined, along with the EU's self-sufficiency in a wide range of agricultural commodities. The statistical journey continues through food processing, distribution, and retail and services provision of food and beverages, with an eye on the impact of COVID-19 and subsequent relaxation of restrictions. It then looks into the consumption of food and beverages, with particular attention on consumer prices for some selected food and beverages, but also on obesity and on food poverty. And the final chapter concerns environmental issues related to the various stages of the food chain, including food waste. I hope that you will find the webinar informative and can use it as a gateway to the world of official statistics, not only in the fields of agriculture and fisheries and the food chain, but to the whole scope of economic, social, and environmental data that are collected in the European statistical system. So, thank you very much.
Thank you, Viveka. And now I'd like to introduce Edward Cook, the Senior Statistician on Agriculture and Fisheries Statistics, who will give us an overview of the presentation Key Figures on the European Food Chain. So over to you, Edward.
Thank you, Tim and Viveka. And thank you for joining us live today for this webinar about the key figures on the European Food Chain publication. My name is Edward Cook, and I'm the editor of this Eurostat publication. Now, everyone has an interest in food and drink, whether for necessity, pleasure, health and nutrition, cultural identity, social interaction, or its environmental impacts. It's in our thoughts when we make decisions about the weekly shop, going out to a restaurant, or hosting dinner parties, as well as part of our health plan when we decide to join the gym or take country walks through farmland. The food and drinks market has global impacts. For example, on the economic welfare of, among others, farmers, food manufacturers, and even waiters in your local restaurant. On the social welfare of, among others, communities who may not be able to access or afford basic foods, or who are agricultural dependent societies. And lastly, on the environment, through, among other things, waste, pollution, resource exploitation and degradation, and species impact. To help people better understand the structure of the European food chain and the changes taking place within it, this publication gives you data and analyses at each step of the chain, from farming to the food scraps going in the bin. But I wanted to make this publication even more relevant to people. So new statistical information was included to also look at the bounce back from COVID, the rising cost of food and drink, the trade in agricultural goods with Ukraine and Russia, the level of self-sufficiency in agricultural commodities in the EU, obesity levels, food poverty and food waste. So let me take you on a quick journey through this publication. So that you can more easily digest the contents of the publication in a webinar, I've prepared a taster menu for you and will present each course or chapter in some tasty bite-sized morsels for you. I hope you like it. The publication traces the chain from primary agricultural and fisheries production through processing, trade, distribution to end consumption, environmental impacts and waste. Let me give you some highlights. Chapter 1 is on farms and the farm labour force. In this year's publication, there was new data from the Agricultural Census 2020, when millions of data records were collected from farmers across the EU. Here are some of the key messages. Family farms account for the vast majority of farms in the EU, almost 95% in 2020. That means typically farms are not big corporations. There were 9.1 million farms in the EU in 2020. Most of these are small. Indeed, 64% were less than 5 hectares in size. This is not industrial style farming. But there is a huge contrast. The few farms over 100 hectares, that's about 4% of the total, collectively farmed slightly more than half of the total area used for production. You can see this in the upper of the 2 clustered bar charts. The number of farms has declined rapidly. There were 5.3 million fewer farms in 2020 than 2005, with the fastest rate of loss among the smallest farms. You can see that in the lower clustered bar chart. So what does this say about the viability of small farms? Farmers tend to be older rather than younger. Let's look at the inverted age pyramid. Here you can see that 1/3 of farmers in 2020 were of pensionable age. Only about 12% of farmers, and by that we mean farm managers, were under 40 years old. So should we be worried about who will farm in the future and provide us with the food we need? Chapter 2 looks at what is produced by farmers in the EU, first in terms of crops and then meat and dairy products. The publication details how much crops were produced in 2021, and then this is compared with years since 2001. So we could ask, is the EU producing more or less than previous years? Let's look at the panel of area charts. Overall, cereals harvested rebounded in 2021 to 297.5 million tonnes from the drought-affected 2020 level. But this was still lower than the 307.9 million tonnes in 2014. Now, the analysis in this publication is supplemented with a separate detailed article that can be accessed through the QR code. And this also includes analysis of weather patterns. It provides some background to understanding how changing weather patterns may be impacting on production levels. Now, we already know that 2022 was a drought year, so we'll see the impact of that in next year's publication. Chapter 3 looks at the economic performance of agriculture. This is important. It's important to track if we want to offer a fair standard of living to farmers. They have to make a living in order to want to carry on farming. The cost of a number of working inputs in agriculture rose very sharply in 2021. We can see the rapid rise in the line graph, an impact of the rising cost of energy. Nevertheless, factor income per full-time person in agriculture has been rising. But as we can see in the line graph, this is principally because the number of farmers among which factor income is notionally shared has declined. Chapter 4 looks at fisheries in the EU in terms of the fishing fleet, catches and aquaculture. The EU's catches of fish from the sea fell to a relative low of 3.8 million tonnes in 2020. We can see this on the right-hand side of the stacked area chart. Now this still sounds like a lot, but there's been a steady downward trend from 5.9 million tonnes in 2001 and 4.8 million tonnes in 2005. And almost 3/4 of all catches came from the Northeast Atlantic. So these data are important to monitor fishing, understanding which seas provide most of our fish, and to gauge the sustainability of catches. There is also fish farming or aquaculture in the EU. and this provided another 1.1 million tonnes of fish and other aquatic organisms in 2020. But as you can see from the line chart, production levels haven't changed very much over the medium term. Chapter 5 looks at the next stage in the chain, the processing stage. In the bubbles, you can see that the processing stage employed another 4.6 million people and generated a further 230 billion euros of value added in 2019. In this way, you can begin to understand that primary production and processing together are important and interrelated sectors of the economy in terms of jobs and money. Chapter 6 looks at trade. The EU trades in lots of agricultural food and products, but also imports lots of agricultural products, especially things that it can't grow or cannot grow all year round. From the stacked column charts, you can see that the EU generally imports raw, unprocessed agricultural and fishery products, while its principal exports are processed food and beverage products. The EU's main trade partner in agricultural, fisheries and food and beverage products in 2021 was the United Kingdom. The UK accounted for 21.9% of the EU's total exports of these products and 8.8% of the value of the EU's imports of these products. The EU had a trade surplus with the UK in these products to the value of 28.7 billion euros in 2021. You can see the breakdown of main trade partners by type of agriculture, fisheries and food and beverage product. An important question is, how will Brexit continue to affect this trade with the UK? We'll only know through the data. The publication highlights the importance of trade in agricultural, fisheries and food and beverage products with Ukraine and Russia. Did you know that Ukraine accounted for about 29% of the EU's imports of cereals in 2021 and about 15% of its imports of vegetable or animal oils and fats? This data helps policymakers understand and anticipate some of the ripple effects of the war in Ukraine, especially when viewed against self-sufficiency data, which we also show in the publication. Moving down the chain, and Chapter 7 looks at the transport of agricultural, forestry and fishery products, food, beverages and tobacco. Did you know that 1.2 billion tonnes of agriculture, forestry and fishery products were transported by EU registered road vehicles in 2020, along with another 1.6 billion tonnes of food, beverages and tobacco products? And the amount on our roads has been increasing steadily over time. You can see this in the time series line chart. What does this mean for transport policy and for emissions? Chapter 8 looks at the wholesale, retail and services provision of food and beverages. This part of the chain is close to customers. It's a big part of the chain. Look at the bubbles and you can see that it employed about 16.9 million persons in the EU in 2019 and had a turnover of 2,287 billion euros. These are big numbers. To a large degree, these businesses and the people employed in it depend on what EU farmers produce and the quality of that produce. Now, the sector was particularly hit hard by COVID. Restaurants and food outlets were closed and then had restrictions, so people ate out far less. As you can see on the right-hand side of the line chart, the turnover of the food and beverage services sector in the EU fell by about 1/3 in 2020. There was, however, a partial rebound in 2021. We can wonder whether COVID will have long-lasting impacts on behaviour. Chapter 9 looks at what we spend on food and beverages and how much we eat. From the ranked stacked column chart, you can see that, on average, households in the EU as a whole spent about 13.5% of their household consumption expenditure on food in 2020. That's the segment in dark green. They also spent about 5% on catering services, things like eating out. Just under 2% on alcoholic beverages, the blue segment, and about 1.3% on non-alcoholic beverages. And together, this represented 21.5% of average household consumption expenditure across the EU. But you can see that there was also huge variation, from an average 16.6% in Germany to 31.5% in Romania. Will these shares come down? Or should we be ready to pay more for our food and drink? From the stacked bars that you can now see, about 60% of the adult male population was overweight, classified as pre-obese or obese. These are figures for the EU and 2019. And this compared with about 45% of adult women. Separately in the publication, we show that obesity rates were higher among low-income people. About 19% of the quintile, the poorest quintile, were obese, compared to about 13% in the wealthiest quintile of the population. What does this imply for health policy and health expenditure? From this line chart, you can see that in 2021, 7.3% of people over the age of 16 in the EU were food poor. This means they were unable to afford a meal with meat, fish, or a vegetarian equivalent every second day. Although this share has fallen over time, there are some member states where it remains particularly high. Look at the ladder on the left-hand side of the page. In Bulgaria, the share was 22.4%, and in Romania, 19.2%. That means roughly between 1/5 and 1/4 of people in those two member states were food poor in 2021. The last chapter of the publication looks at the relationship between agriculture, food, and the environment. From the line graph, you can see that greenhouse gas emissions from agricultural processes fell sharply between 1990 and 2006. Since when, however, they've remained relatively unchanged. greenhouse gas emissions from agricultural processes accounted for 11.4% of total greenhouse gas emissions in 2020. Note the fall-off in greenhouse gas emissions for the economy as a whole in 2020 as COVID restrictions impacted, and how this contrasted with agricultural emissions. And from the block graphic, you can see the main components of agricultural greenhouse gas emissions. Methane emissions from enteric fermentation in livestock, particularly cattle and sheep, and nitrous oxide emissions from agricultural soils, coming particularly from the use of nitrogenous fertilizers, accounted for a combined 80% share of all agricultural greenhouse gas emissions. And lastly, from the pie chart, you can see that when all food waste was collected and averaged out per person in the EU, it came to 128 kilos of food waste collected per person in 2020. Wow. And households accounted for a small majority of that food waste, 55% of it. So as you can see, and as you've heard, there are lots of data to describe the European food chain. The data are there to measure key indicators, to inform the public and advise policymakers. The data are publicly available for free on our Euro-based database and can be found using the links under each graphic and infographic in the publication. So I hope that you can relate to every stage in the chain and see how important agriculture is as the foundation for a longer food chain. Thank you.
Thank you, Edward, for that. And now we're going to move into our Q&A session. And I'd just like to remind you first that we've been gathering questions via Slido. There's the code again. What I will say is that we've had an encouraging response on Slido with a lot of questions. We will try and get through as many as we can, but we do like to stick to time. So we may post some answers in Slido afterwards if we haven't got to questions, or we might post our user support email address, so that questions we don't get round to, we'll invite you to send to us and we'll answer them afterwards, but we'll see how we do. So I'm going to start now by introducing the panel, and I apologise to my colleagues if I pronounce any of your names wrongly. But we've got Viveka, the director, is back on the panel. Edward is back on the panel, but we also have some new colleagues, or ones you haven't yet seen on the panel. So we have Ruxanda Enescu, who is the head of unit for agriculture and fisheries. We have Helena Ramos, who is the team leader for statistics on farms. We have Jose Domingo Martinez Solano, who is the team leader for animal statistics. Alessio Scian, who is the team leader for fisheries, and Federico Cardigos, who is the statistical officer also on fisheries. So with no further ado, I'm going to try and start with the questions, and I apologise if I miss a question. I've been trying to keep an eye on them all as we go. So the first question was, do you consider collecting retail prices for fruits and vegetables in your database? And I think Edward has an answer for this.
Yeah, thank you, Tim. So yes, Eurostat has a food price monitoring tool, and this is available in Eurobase. It gives monthly price indices, the latest being for January 2023, and you can look at it in terms of the indices or the rates of change. The tool is described. What I think I will do is try and share my screen and take you through the database. So I hope you can see this. This is Eurostat's homepage. And under data, you can see we have our free to access public database, various themes, and included under economy and finance, you'll see something on prices. If you go to other price statistics, you will see the food price monitoring tool. And if you click on the spreadsheet icon, you'll go through to the data. And if you click on the icon with the M, you'll then get a methodological explanation. So I think just a little bit more on that the monitoring tool itself has information for 26 food aggregates and positions, and this includes fruit and separately vegetables. And the information for those two products is available for consumer prices, commodity prices, and import prices. So thank you, Tim.
Tim, you are muted.
I am very sorry, I was muted there. Yeah, I will add a little bit extra to that. As Edward showed you, these are largely data on price changes. We don't actually collect and publish actual prices, but one other thing we do collect and publish is what we call price level indices, which are in the same area of the database, and they give you the relative prices across Europe and in that I've just checked, and one category is fruit and vegetables, so you can compare where they're most expensive and where they're cheapest. Okay, so we'll move on now. Question 2 is what plans are in place to make European farming sustainable and resilient for future shocks? And I believe Viveka will try to answer that one.
Thank you very much, Tim. Yes, so thank you for the question. Since we are a stats office, we are not really dealing with the plans in place to sort of see what can happen ahead. What we are doing and what we are discussing here is the facts on the ground and what we are measuring in various ways so that you can see aspects of sustainability. But the actual plans are made in countries, they're made in the EU by policy agents. And of course, the Common Agriculture Policy is one of those, and also the farm to fork policies that are now being made to make sure that farming is as sustainable as possible. In the stats offices, what we do is that when crises come up, like we've seen with the COVID crisis and now also the energy crisis, we really try to make sure that we can use the stat system to make it sort of the extra interesting things, like we have just discussed with maybe there is droughts, maybe there is price problems of various types, so that cause food poverty, then we try to shine a special light on that. But plans we are not part of making. We're listening to what plans are being planned so that we can hopefully have the data there to see what happened afterwards, so to speak. But we're not looking into the future. Thanks.
Thank you, Viveka. So the next question, do you have info about bycatch and where amount of fish that are caught per EU country? So I believe Alessio is going to attempt to answer this one.
Yeah, thank you very much, Tim. And thank you also very much for the interesting question. Unfortunately, we don't have at present data on bycatches, but we are working to a new regulation, as currently just a proposal that hopefully will include this data. About data on catches, it is available in the Eurostat website for free, split by country. I may try to show my screen if I manage to to show you where to look. I hope you can see it. It is under agriculture and fishery. I will look here in catches and I will choose the first one, the major. Okay, I hope this is enough. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alessio. Question 4. How do you define a family farm? Are all the countries using the same definition? I think Helena knows the answer to this. You're muted, are you?
Sorry. Thank you, Tim. Indeed, in Eurostat, we use the definition of family farm that is provided by the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations, the FAO, where a farm is considered a family farm when the labor which is provided by the holder and his family members represents more than half or more than half of the total work on the farm. Therefore, in a way, we can say that everyone that contributes with data for Eurostat is using the same definition of family farm. In respect to this, we are planning to update our Statistics Explained article on family farms in the EU in the coming weeks. So we will have more information and updated information on this soon.
Thank you, Helena. I'll just add an interjection there myself as well. You'll note that Helena mentioned the FAO and that our definition is consistent with the FAO. This is actually very common. Where we can use an internationally agreed definition, we often do, because it enables at least to make an attempt at comparisons with countries outside the EU, which is in many areas is used. So, moving on to question 5, were these numbers adjusted with Brexit? Ruxi, I think you have an answer.
Yes, thank you very much, Tim. So indeed, these numbers are adjusted with a Brexit event. So even before the Brexit took place, practically Eurostat has invested a lot of efforts for recalculating comparable and comparable EU aggregates. So all the data that you have seen, and if you see European aggregates, which are in a time series, be sure that these data are comparable and they represent the present composition of the European Union with 27 member states, so without UK. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruxi. The next question, you mentioned that the Statistics Explained articles give more detail. Can you please show an example, perhaps using a QR code from the publication? Edward, are you going to have a go at this?
Yeah, thank you, Tim. Thank you for the question. Firstly, let me show you. This is the publication. Here's a QR code. And if I share my screen, I'll show you the portal where you can look at the articles. So I hope you can now see my screen.
Yes, Edward.
Thank you. And this is Eurostat's Statistics Explained web pages. And you can see that there is a theme on agriculture, forestry and fisheries. We can click on that. We separate them out. We click on agriculture in this case. I'm going to choose an article on crops. And here we have it. And each article tends to start with a few tweets and a graphic. In this case, we have a dynamic graphic showing the changes in the production of cereals. And I wanted to show this one because we have a lot of detail here on the agrometeorological review. And this is important because obviously weather patterns have a huge impact on crops, and indeed go further down the chain. They have a big impact, for example, on milk. Think about what happens if we don't have much grass growing in the fields. The cows won't produce as much milk. So we have this agrometeorological review, which gives details season by season. And then what we've done is to try and show a map with details of the overarching weather patterns. And so in 2021, you could see that, as denoted by the elements that are in orange or red, so in Italy, Hungary, parts of Romania and Bulgaria, as well as into Turkey, that there were quite severe droughts. And what we expect to see when we do the same map next year is that much of the EU and Turkey will also be in red because of the drought. So we give a far greater level of detail in these articles, where we not only give the agrometeorological report, but we look by crop type as well. So there's an example. Thank you for the question. And there are indeed many articles in here that we update on a regular basis. So
thank you. Thank you, Edward. The next question is, how do you define sustainable fishing in terms of data figures? Is it the same for all countries? And I believe Federico will handle this one.
Yes, thank you. Good afternoon. Sustainability is a very complex definition, so it's impossible to just grabbing the figures to say if there is a sustainable fishery or not. But as a first approach, we can say that if the numbers are quite constant or slightly going up or slightly going down, probably the fishery is sustainable. But this is not the complete answer. It's impossible just looking at the figures to have a complete answer. So then it's necessary to go and further investigate using other tools, scientific tools, and even opinion tools, because sustainability is quite political. So it's not the definite answer that we have on our portal, but for sure, for each species, if you see the trend along the years according to each area, it's possible to have a first glance if that particular fishery is sustainable or not. But it's not the final answer. You have to dig more into science and even into the politics. And of course, this changes according to country. As it changes according to area, it changes also according to country, because countries, they have different fleets, they have different approaches to the environment, and they have even different situations in the environment for a start. So it's not easy to have the answer, but you can start in Eurostat.
Okay, thank you, Federica. The next question, he says, scrolling through quickly to find it, the number of farms has decreased. How does this relate to the number of farmers? Helena, are you going to start on this?
Yes. So far, the data that you see in the key figures publication and the data that is published in the Euro-based tables is only yet referring to the managers. We have not yet published the data for the labor force of the farms, the data that is coming from the census. The tables will be published in the next months, but we do have other data collections that deal with labor. So I think I give the floor now to Domingo, who is responsible for the economic accounts for agriculture. Can you already provide some information?
Yes, thank you very much, Elena. Indeed, we have information available on labor input, and this is a relevant question because as the number of farms have decreased, the number of farmers have decreased substantially as well in the past years. Since 2010, we have had a decrease in the total labor input of 25% until 2022. Which are the latest data available to the last year, of course. And this is the decrease is explained basically because of the drop in the number of, in the labor input of the non-salaried labor force, that is the farmers. What it has not decreased and has remained basically stable, even have increased with 1% is the salaried labor force. So this means while the number of farms have decreased, the labor input, the total labor input has remained stable. This explains what Elena and Edward were pointing out before of this farm concentration process that we have been experiencing in the last years.
Thank you, Domingo. Next question. who is behind the 4% farming half of the utilised agricultural area? Your older farmers, younger farmers, both? So Helena, can we say anything about these 4% of the large farms?
Yes. The table where you can find this information is EFM Farm Manager. And even if the EU aggregates are not yet published there, you can already see the tendency that they are, for these big farms, they are not the younger managers, they are not the older managers. The bulk is concentrated in the larger than 45 years old and less than 65 years old. For the exact numbers, we can put the link to the table in Slido later on, I think. It will be nice for you to be able to see how the evolution has happened since 2016 and so on. Thank you.
Thank you, Helena. The next question is, are seasonal workers contributing to the reliability of the European food chain? And that, I think, Domingo was going to answer.
Yes, thank you very much, Tim. As Lena was mentioning before, the structural data are not available yet, which could provide more details. Currently, we should take the annual data from the economic accounts for agriculture, which have information on agricultural labor input, and there we can take some information that we were using for a previous answer. It is definitely improving the sustainability and the reliability of the food chain, the use of seasonal labor input. This labor input is usually salaried input, and as we have seen, this is the part of the labor force which has remained stable in the past 10-15 years, while the number of farmers, the number of and the labor input provided by the farmers have declined drastically. So indeed, this has a big contribution. Here we should also mention the importance of the productivity. Farms are becoming more and more efficient, and even with the decline in labor input, the output produced, the crops and the animal production produced by the farms have increased in that same period. And this is because farms are innovating, are investing in machinery, in new techniques, and they are becoming more and more productive. That's a very important part of the sustainability.
Thank you, Domingo. Let me see, the next question is, yes. So next question was import and export of wood products, export of wood to China. I think I'll intervene on this one. Yes, we have very detailed data on imports and exports in our external trade database, but as you may guess, the agricultural statistics team are not the experts on the external trade database. So for that, we'll make contact with you via Slido and see about directing you to who you can ask for that. But we do have detailed data on imports and exports available. I don't know if anybody in the agriculture team has anything they want to add to that. No. Okay, so we'll move on to the next question. So you showed the relatively large number of enterprises active in retail. Do you have any data on concentration or the lack of it in retail? So I think this is quite a complex question, but I think again, Domingo is going to tell us what he can about this.
Thank you very much, Tim. Yes, here we can refer as well to our colleagues in business statistics who can really provide all the information available on concentration of retail enterprises. But usually when users ask about the concentration in the retail sector, they are very worried about the transmission of prices across the whole food chain. And there, Edward was speaking before and was showing how to access the food price monitoring tool. This is a key element that in which Eurostat has invested a lot of efforts in order to, for the sake of the market transparency. And that means the food contains information on the agricultural commodity prices, the prices at farm gate, the producer price index of agricultural products, and the consumer prices, as Edward was explaining in a previous question. We have also, the users can also access there the import prices. And with all these elements, it is possible to assess and evaluate how the prices are transmitted across the food chain. And this is a very important part, in addition to the concentration of enterprises in the retail sectors, which users can find in structural business statistics, as well as the concentration in agricultural farms can be found in the farm structure statistics that Elena has explained before.
Okay, thank you, Domingo. I'm just checking, looking at my colleagues. I believe we've answered all the questions that have been posed via Slido. As I've said, we'll be putting some extra detail, and we have been putting some extra detail into Slido, links and so on. So I think with no more questions to answer, we'll start to wrap up. I would like to mention one other thing. If you've enjoyed listening to Helena answer questions, you can get more of Helena because she did a podcast for Eurostat on the agricultural census. It was released in December. We'll post the link in Slido to the podcast page where you can get that podcast. And of course, the agricultural census, just like the population census, is a very important thing for Eurostat and for Europeans' agricultural statistics, because we actually go out and ask every farm in the EU what they do and facts and figures about them. So that's a very interesting podcast about the agricultural census. Then I will mention as well that the next webinar we have coming up is planned for the 6th of March. It's a webinar in honour of International Women's Day, and we're going to be looking this year at women in science, technology and research. And we'll have speakers both from Eurostat and I believe from an appropriate policy DG. And that's the 6th of March, 10 o'clock till 11 o'clock in the morning, the next webinar. We're not stopping there. We don't have a date set yet, but we are planning to do a webinar looking at the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, and one on transport. Okay, so we also have a question for you. And maybe you can tell us in Slido. So we would like to ask if there's anything about the food chain that you feel is missing and should be added to future editions of the book. So I'll remind you again, the Slido, we have a QR code, we have a number if you want to go direct to the website and type in the number of the Slido. But if you want to give us suggestions in Slido of subjects that we could add to expand on the European food chain, to illustrate it further, we'd love to hear that. Also, I remind you again that please don't just log off immediately the webinar ends. Stay in Slido and answer our brief survey. I promise you it's not long and it's not tricky. With that being said, I will just check my notes to make sure I've said everything I'm supposed to say. Yes. Then if there's anything you think of after the seminar, after the webinar, any question that you think, oh gosh, I should have asked that, we have a multilingual user support which can be found through our website. It's under help on our website, and there you can pose any other questions you want, and we will try and answer them there. Other than that, all that remains is for me to thank my colleagues for their time in this webinar, to hope that it's been useful and interesting for you. And as I say, we'll see you again on the 6th of March for the next in this series. Thank you.